Imagine yourself in the Middle Ages, centuries ago, when the rhythm of life was guided not by clocks or alarms, but by the rising and setting of the sun and by the ringing of church bells echoing across villages and towns. As midday arrived, people across Europe paused from their labors, their prayers, or their duties to share a meal that, though modest by today's standards, was central to their daily life. This was lunch in the medieval world, sometimes humble, sometimes lavish, always a reflection of status, belief, and survival. Today, we'll journey back in time to uncover what lunch truly looked like in the Middle Ages. And as you settle in, let this story guide you gently into sleep. Before we begin, a quick favor. If you enjoy drifting off to calm history, make sure you subscribe to our channel, History for Sleep. It helps you discover more relaxing journeys into the past, and it helps us keep making these long, soothing stories for you. I'd also love to hear from you in the comments. Tell us what topics you'd like to explore next, and let us know when you usually listen, whether it's to help you fall asleep at night, to relax during the day, or to calm your mind in the middle of a restless night. Your comments shape the stories we create. Now, let us set the scene. The medieval world was one of contrasts. A peasant's lunch might consist of a thick pottage with a hunk of bread eaten quickly in the fields, while a noble's midday meal could stretch across multiple courses with roasted meats spiced, sauces and musicians playing in the background. Between these extremes lay the daily lives of monks, merchants, and townsfolk, each with their own customs and traditions. This story will take you through the fields, into the monasteries, through the bustling markets, and into the grand halls of castles, exploring what lunch truly meant in the Middle Ages. So settle back, let your breathing slow, and allow yourself to drift with the rhythm of the past. Together, we'll unfold the forgotten world of medieval lunch one slow, detailed step at a time. In the Middle Ages, the rhythm of the day was very different from our own. Today, many of us structure our time by precise hours and minutes, with lunch scheduled neatly into the middle of a workday, often at 12 o'clock or perhaps 1. But in the medieval world, time was not measured by the ticking of a clock on the wall. Instead, it was guided by the light of the sun, the cycle of prayer, and the sound of church bells that echoed through villages, towns, and cities. To understand lunch in the Middle Ages, we must first understand how people measured their days, and why the midday meal carried such importance. For most people, the day began very early, often at dawn. Farmers and laborers rose with the sun, or even before, tending to animals, fields, or workshops, before the heat of the day arrived. Nobles, too, had a rhythm to their mornings, though their routines included prayer, planning, and sometimes meetings or audiences with those who served them. Monks, in monasteries across Europe, followed strict schedules marked by the ringing of bells. The day was divided into sections, called canonical hours, each tied to prayer and devotion. In these hours, one of the most important moments was known as sext, which fell around midday. After the prayers of sext, monks were permitted to eat their main meal of the day. For much of medieval society, this aligned with the idea of a midday meal, what we might call lunch. Unlike today, when breakfast, lunch, and dinner are expected parts of daily life, medieval people did not always eat 3 meals. In fact, many people had just 2, one in the late morning or midday, and another in the evening. For peasants, the first food of the day might come after several hours of hard work, and this could be little more than a hunk of bread or a drink of ale to break the hunger. The larger meal, taken around midday, provided much-needed energy for the work that still lay ahead. For nobles and the wealthy, the midday meal could be the grandest feast of the day, with multiple courses and entertainment. And for monks, lunch was carefully timed with prayer, consumed in silence, and dictated by rules of simplicity. The time of lunch itself could vary greatly depending on where one lived and what one did. In southern Europe, where the midday sun grew hot, Meals were often taken earlier, allowing people to rest during the hottest part of the day. In northern regions, the meal might be eaten later, sometimes stretching into what we might consider the afternoon. It was rarely fixed to a single hour, since few people owned clocks. Instead, the sound of the church bell guided people to pause their labor. When the bell for sext rang, echoing through fields and markets, it reminded all who heard it that the time for a pause had come. For peasants, this pause was essential. Imagine the fields, stretching under the sun, where men and women worked with sickles, plows, and animals. The body needed strength, and so lunch was often taken in the fields themselves. Bread and cheese might be carried in a small cloth, perhaps with a bit of onion or a flask of ale. These foods were portable, filling, and simple. Workers might sit together, resting in the shade if possible, sharing their meal in the midst of their toil. The midday pause was as much about recovery as it was about nourishment, a brief moment of rest before the work resumed. In monasteries, the midday meal followed ritual. The monks gathered in their refectory, sitting in long rows, often in silence. A reader might recite scripture while the brothers ate, their attention drawn to spiritual nourishment even as they consumed bread, vegetables, or fish. The timing was exact, tied to prayer, and the rules were strict. Meat from four-legged animals was often forbidden, and the meal was one of restraint, not indulgence. Yet it was also the moment of the day when the body was replenished, preparing the monks for their duties of prayer, study, and labor. For nobles and lords, lunch was a different matter. The timing could stretch later, closer to what we might call early afternoon, and the meal could last for hours. Guests might gather, musicians might play, and servants would bring dishes in succession. Bread, always present, was served alongside meats, fish, sauces, and sometimes sweetened dishes. The midday feast was not just about food. It was about status, hospitality, and display. To eat well, and to be seen eating well, was a marker of power and wealth. The rhythms of noble life allowed for such lengthy meals, unlike the quick bites of peasants in the fields. In towns and cities, the midday meal was shaped by the busy life of markets and crafts. Merchants might eat quickly between dealings, while craftsmen and apprentices paused from their work in shops and guild halls. Street food stalls sometimes offered meals that could be taken on the go, a quick answer to hunger for those who could afford to purchase rather than prepare their own food. Here, the timing of lunch was more flexible, but the concept of stopping for sustenance in the middle of the day remained. What tied all these different groups together, peasants, monks, nobles, and townsfolk, was the idea that midday was the time to replenish the body. Whether taken in haste or with grandeur, lunch was a natural break in the flow of life. It was a pause between the labor of morning and the tasks of afternoon, between prayers and work, between the demands of survival and the rituals of faith or power. The medieval day was a cycle of labor, devotion, and survival, and lunch stood at the center of it. To understand what foods were eaten and how they differed between classes and communities, we must first appreciate that lunch was not simply about filling the stomach. It was about rhythm, order, and meaning in a world where time flowed differently. Bells, not clocks, called people to eat. The sun marked the passing of hours. And in that world, the midday meal was both practical and symbolic, the moment when the body was allowed to rest, to be nourished, and to gather strength for the work that lay ahead. This rhythm, though long faded, still echoes in the pages of history. To imagine lunch in the Middle Ages is to imagine a world where every pause was precious, where the body's needs were recognized amid the weight of duty, faith, and survival. And so, as we continue our journey, we will see how this rhythm shaped the very foods that graced the tables of peasants, monks, nobles, and merchants across the centuries. When we speak of lunch in the Middle Ages, it is important to remember that not everyone experienced it in the same way. What you ate, when you ate, and even whether you ate at all, depended greatly on who you were. Medieval society was not equal, and the differences between peasants, nobles, and clergy shaped the meaning of the midday meal in striking ways. To truly understand lunch, we must step into the shoes of each of these groups and imagine how their lives, responsibilities, and resources shaped the food they consumed. For the peasant, life was built on survival. Most peasants were bound to the land, working as farmers or laborers, tied to the estates of lords and nobles. Their days were filled with backbreaking work plowing, sowing, harvesting, tending livestock, repairing tools, gathering wood, and countless other tasks that kept the medieval economy alive. Lunch for a peasant was rarely a feast. It was fuel. Bread was the most common foundation, often made from coarse grains such as barley, rye, or oats, since fine wheat bread was too costly. This bread might be eaten with cheese, which could be made at home from cow, goat, or sheep's milk, or with onions and leeks pulled from the garden. A simple pottage, a thick soup of grains, beans, and whatever vegetables were in season, might also be eaten if there was time to prepare it beforehand. The food was plain, but filling, designed to keep the body moving for long hours of labor. Meat was rare for peasants, often limited to special days, or small amounts of bacon or salted pork stretched carefully through the week. Fish might be eaten when available, particularly in regions near rivers or the sea, but it was by no means guaranteed. Still, even the humble meal of the peasant had meaning beyond survival. Families often shared lunch together in the fields or at home, breaking bread as a moment of togetherness amid their work. The simplicity of the food reinforced the reality of their place in society. They labored to sustain not only themselves, but also the higher classes who lived from their efforts. Their lunch reflected both necessity and duty, an unvarnished reminder of the fragile balance of survival in a world with little margin for waste. The noble's lunch, by contrast, was shaped by wealth, status, and display. For the lord or lady of a castle, or the wealthy merchant who had risen in fortune, lunch was an opportunity not merely to eat, but to show power. Unlike the peasant, whose meal might be eaten in haste, nobles often lingered at the table. Meals were served in courses, with attendants bringing platters of roasted meats, fish, pies, sauces, and even exotic dishes flavored with imported spices like pepper, cinnamon, or saffron. Bread was ever present, but for the noble, it was made from fine wheat flour, white and soft, a luxury beyond the reach of most peasants. Wine or spiced ale might accompany the meal, and fruits, both fresh and dried, could appear at the end of the meal alongside sweetened pastries or custards. Yet even in the noble household, lunch was not always a grand feast. Practicality still played its role, particularly for those who managed estates or traveled. A noble hunting party might pause in the woods to eat bread, cheese, cold meats, and wine carried along by servants. The grandeur of lunch shifted with circumstance, but what distinguished the noble table from the peasants was variety, richness, and abundance. To eat richly was to live richly, and to live richly was to demonstrate one's place at the top of the medieval hierarchy. Clergy occupied a middle ground between these two worlds, but with their own unique customs. Monks, priests, and nuns shaped their meals around rules of faith, fasting, and prayer. For monks in particular, lunch was the central meal of the day, taken after the service of sext. The rule of Saint Benedict, which guided many monasteries, emphasized moderation. Meals were to be simple, sufficient to sustain, but not to indulge. Bread, beans, lentils, and vegetables formed the heart of monastic lunch, accompanied by ale or water. Meat from four-legged animals was often forbidden, but fish and poultry were more commonly permitted, especially on feast days. Silence was usually observed in the refectory, and a monk would read aloud from Scripture while the others ate, reminding all present that food was meant to nourish the spirit as well as the body. Not all clergy lived with such restraint, of course. Bishops and abbots, who held power and influence, often dined more lavishly, their tables resembling those of nobles rather than the humble fare of monks. Wealthy monasteries with abundant land could provide their members with fish ponds, orchards, and even exotic spices purchased through trade. Thus, while the ideal of simplicity governed religious meals, the reality often varied depending on wealth and location. Between these three groups, peasant, noble, and clergy, the medieval lunch reveals the deep divisions of society. A peasant's crust of bread and onion contrasted sharply with a noble's roasted meats or a monk's carefully portioned fish. Yet in each case, the meal was more than food. For peasants, it was the sustenance that kept them alive through unrelenting labor. For nobles, it was an expression of prestige and power, a moment to display wealth and generosity. For clergy, it was an act bound up in faith, structured by prayer, and often tempered by rules of restraint. It is worth noting, too, that these categories could blur. A prosperous peasant might enjoy little meat more often than his neighbors. A poor knight might find his table looking more like that of a peasant than a noble. And among the clergy, there was always tension between the ideals of humility and the temptations of abundance. But as a whole, these groups remind us that lunch in the Middle Ages was never just about eating. It was about who you were, where you belonged, and what your place in the great hierarchy of medieval life demanded of you. As we move forward, we will look more closely at the foods themselves. The bread that lay at the center of nearly every meal, the pottages that sustained the poor, and the meats and fish that marked wealth and privilege. For now, it is enough to see that lunch was as much a reflection of identity as it was a source of nourishment. To ask what someone ate at midday in the Middle Ages is to ask, in a way, who they were. And that question leads us deeper into the heart of the medieval world. If there was one food that united all of medieval Europe, it was bread. To speak of lunch in the Middle Ages without speaking of bread would be impossible. Whether you were a peasant working the fields, a monk sitting in the cloistered refectory, or a noble dining in a great hall, bread was present. It was not only food, it was a symbol of life itself, the cornerstone of survival, and often the dividing line between hunger and fullness. To understand medieval lunch, we must place bread at its center, for it was the daily bread that truly sustained the people of the Middle Ages. Bread came in many forms, and its quality depended greatly on class and circumstance. For peasants, bread was coarse and dark, made from barley, rye, or oats, sometimes mixed together. Wheat, which makes the soft, white loaves we are familiar with today, was expensive and difficult to grow in many regions. For this reason, it was reserved for the wealthy. Peasant bread was often dense, heavy, and sometimes flavored by whatever grains were available, even chestnut flour or beans. It filled the stomach, but it was not the airy, soft bread we imagine when we think of a modern loaf. It could be chewy, gritty, and sometimes sour. Yet it was vital. Without bread, most peasants could not survive, and shortages of grain led quickly to hunger, unrest, and famine. Nobles, on the other hand, enjoyed what was known as manchet, a fine white bread made from wheat flour that had been carefully sifted. This bread was lighter, softer, and far more pleasant to eat than the coarse loaves of the poor. For nobles, bread was not only nourishment, but also a marker of refinement. At their tables, bread served multiple roles. It was eaten alongside meats and sauces. It was used to mop up juices, and most importantly, it served as the base for something called a trencher. A trencher was a thick slice of stale bread placed on the table as a kind of edible plate. Food was piled onto it, juices soaking into the bread. After the meal, the trencher might be eaten, given to servants, or distributed to the poor waiting at the gates of the castle. Thus, bread was more than a food. It was part of the entire system of dining, connecting the noble's meal to both their household and the wider community. Monks and clergy also relied heavily on bread, though often in a more measured way. In monasteries, bread was provided daily, usually simple loaves made from whatever grain the monastery produced. It was a staple in their diet, eaten with pottage, vegetables, and fish. Bread represented both humility and abundance, for though it was simple, it was plentiful in most monasteries with successful farms. In times of fasting, when other foods were restricted, bread often remained a constant, reminding monks of the biblical phrase, "Give us this day our daily bread." It was both practical and spiritual, sustaining the body while symbolizing divine provision. Bread was so central to medieval life that it was woven deeply into language, ritual, and culture. The word Lord itself comes from an Old English phrase meaning loaf guardian, and lady from loaf kneader. These words reflect how bread was bound to identity and authority. To provide bread was to provide life, and those who controlled grain and flour controlled much of society. Bakers, too, held a crucial role, and their trade was tightly regulated in medieval towns. Laws controlled the size and weight of loaves to prevent fraud, and punishments for dishonest bakers could be harsh. Bread was too important to allow cheating. It was the very foundation of trust between people and their rulers. At lunch, bread was rarely eaten alone. For peasants, it was dipped into pottage or eaten with a bit of cheese, making a simple but sustaining meal. A hunk of bread could be carried into the fields, wrapped in a cloth, and eaten quickly between tasks. For nobles, bread framed the entire dining experience. Trenchers soaked up sauces, while finer loaves might be sliced and shared at the table. Bread appeared in the rituals of hospitality as well, offered to guests as a sign of welcome. Even in the poorest households, offering bread was a gesture of kindness, and to refuse bread was to refuse fellowship. Bread also changed with the seasons and with fortune. In times of plenty, loaves were larger, softer, and more flavorful. In times of scarcity, bread might be stretched with fillers ground beans, peas, acorns, or even straw. Such bread was harder to digest, and sometimes dangerous to health, but hunger left little choice. Famines, when they struck, often began as shortages of grain. Without bread, meals collapsed into desperation. Chronicles from the Middle Ages are filled with accounts of hardship when bread failed, and the fear of an empty granary haunted every village. There were also ritual and symbolic roles for bread. At religious feasts, special breads might be baked, enriched with honey or spices. At weddings, loaves were broken to symbolize unity. And in the Christian faith, bread held the highest meaning of all, representing the body of Christ in the sacrament of the Eucharist. In this way, bread was not only the foundation of lunch, but the foundation of medieval culture itself, at once physical and spiritual, ordinary and sacred. The universality of bread makes it a key to understanding the medieval lunch. Imagine a peasant tearing off a rough crust to dip in warm pottage after a morning in the fields. Imagine a monk eating a slice of bread in silence as scripture is read aloud. Imagine a noble placing roasted meat on a trencher, juices soaking into the stale bread beneath. All three, so different in their status and wealth, are joined in one common act, eating bread. It was the food that defined the Middle Ages, a constant across class and culture. In many ways, bread was the measure of life itself. To have bread was to endure. To lack it was to suffer. It was present at every table, from the poorest hovel to the richest castle, shaping the experience of lunch and shaping the very meaning of sustenance. More than any other food, it bound medieval people together in the shared rhythm of daily survival. And so, as we continue exploring the foods of lunch in the Middle Ages, bread remains always at the center, the staff of life upon which all else depended. If bread was the foundation of medieval lunch, then soups, stews, and pottages were its companion, filling bowls and bellies across Europe. For the medieval world, pottage was more than just a dish, it was a way of life. Simple, adaptable, and endlessly variable. It was eaten by peasants and nobles alike, though with very different ingredients and expectations. To imagine lunch in the Middle Ages without picturing a pot simmering over the fire, thick with grains, vegetables, and sometimes meat, would be to miss the very heart of daily eating. The word pottage comes from the same root as pot, and that is precisely what it was. Whatever could be boiled together in a pot until it became thick, hearty, and filling. For peasants, pottage was often the main dish of lunch, served alongside bread. It was cheap to make, stretching a small number of ingredients to feed many mouths, and it could be left to simmer while other tasks were carried out. A typical peasant pottage might include barley or oats as a base, thickened with beans or peas and flavored with onions, leeks, or cabbages from the garden. Sometimes herbs such as parsley, sage, or thyme would be added to give taste. On rare occasions, small bits of bacon or a bone from a pig might be thrown in, but more often the flavor came from vegetables and the earth itself. Because peasants relied so heavily on pottage, its contents changed with the seasons. In spring, it might be bright with fresh greens like spinach or nettles. In summer, it might hold peas, broad beans, and garden herbs. In autumn, root vegetables such as turnips and carrots made their way into the pot, and in winter, dried legumes and stored cabbages kept the meal alive. This cycle of the seasons gave peasant life a rhythm, not only in labor but in taste. Lunch might not be exciting, but it was nourishing, dependable, and tied directly to the land. In this way, the peasants' pottage was both food and reflection of the world around them. For nobles, pottage was also common, though it looked and tasted quite different. At the table of a lord or lady, a pottage might be enriched with beef, chicken, or fish, simmered with almonds, saffron, or imported spices. Recipes for noble pottages, preserved in medieval cookbooks, show a fondness for blending flavors. Meats combined with fruits, like prunes or raisins, spices with wine or vinegar, producing dishes that were both savory and sweet. While the peasant's pottage was about survival, the noble's was about refinement, an opportunity to demonstrate wealth through ingredients and skill. At noble lunches, pottage was sometimes served as a first course, warming the stomach before the roasted meats arrived. It was still a dish of the pot, but the contents of that pot spoke volumes about class and fortune. Monasteries, too, leaned heavily on pottage, though there's reflected rules of restraint. A midday meal in many monasteries centered around a bowl of vegetable or legume pottage, thick with beans, lentils, or peas. Fish might be added on permitted days, but the absence of meat was common. Seasonings were modest, and the emphasis was on sustenance without indulgence. Yet even within monasteries, the quality of pottage could vary. Wealthier institutions with access to fertile lands or generous donations might prepare richer versions, while poorer monasteries depended on the simplest of legumes and garden herbs. For monks, the steaming bowl of pottage at midday was a quiet constant in their spiritual routine, a reminder of moderation and discipline. One of the most interesting aspects of medieval pottage was its adaptability. It could be thin and brothy, closer to a soup, or thick enough to be scooped with a chunk of bread. Some pottages were called frumenty, made from boiled wheat or barley, sometimes flavored with milk, broth, or spices. Others resembled what we might call stews today, with larger cuts of meat and vegetables simmering together. The boundaries between soup, stew, and pottage were loose, and the terms often overlapped. What mattered most was that it was filling, warm, and sustaining. The method of cooking also tells us much about medieval households. The central hearth, where a pot might hang over the fire, was the heart of peasant homes. The smell of a pottage cooking over an open flame was the smell of daily life. In castles and noble halls, larger kitchens with multiple fires and cauldrons allowed for several varieties of pottage to be prepared at once, offering choice and variety to those at the table. In monasteries, large pots simmered steadily, preparing food for dozens or even hundreds of monks at a time. Everywhere, the bubbling of the pot was a sound of life continuing, of hunger being answered. Lunch built around pottage was practical in another way. It was communal. A large pot could serve an entire family, a work crew, or a community of monks. People gathered around the table or in the fields, each with their own portion, sharing from the same source. It was food that brought people together, whether in humble cottages or grand halls. The act of eating pottage at lunch was not only about filling the stomach, but also about affirming bonds, family bonds, community bonds, and even spiritual bonds. Yet, despite its ubiquity, pottage could also reveal inequality. A poor man's pottage might be thin, with only a few vegetables and grains, while a noble's could be rich with almonds, saffron, and tender meat. The same dish, the same idea, but worlds apart in reality. This contrast reminds us that lunch in the Middle Ages was never a single experience. It was a mirror of society, reflecting wealth, status, and opportunity in every bowl. Still, whether humble or luxurious, pottage endured as the great staple of medieval meals. Its endurance speaks to its practicality. It made use of what was available, stretched ingredients to feed many, and could be adapted endlessly. It warmed the body in cold winters, refreshed it in cooler, lighter versions in summer, and provided comfort in a world where comfort was often scarce. For peasants, it was the familiar taste of home. For nobles, it was a canvas for display. For monks, it was a discipline of simplicity. And for all, it was lunch. Imagine now the medieval midday pause. A peasant family ladling out steaming bowls of barley and bean pottage dipping in rough bread. A noble seated at a long table savoring a spiced chicken pottage enriched with almonds and raisins. Monks eating in silence, the reader's voice carrying over the refectory as their spoons rise and fall. In each scene, the meal centers on a pot and its contents, reminding us of the shared humanity of hunger and nourishment. The world has changed in countless ways since the Middle Ages, but the humble pot of soup or stew still speaks across the centuries. It tells us that even in times of hardship, people found ways to nourish themselves, to share food, and to give meaning to the act of eating together. Lunch in the Middle Ages, built so often on pottage, was a daily affirmation of endurance, resourcefulness, and community. If bread and pottage formed the steady rhythm of medieval lunch, then meat and fish added the notes of variety, luxury, and distinction. For most people, the presence of meat or fish at a midday meal was not guaranteed, and it told a clear story about wealth, privilege, and place in society. To understand who could afford these foods, and when they appeared on the table, we must look closely at the realities of medieval life. For in those details, the very structure of class and custom is revealed. For peasants, meat was a rare treat. The animals they kept, pigs, chickens, cows, and sheep, were valuable resources, providing milk, wool, eggs, or labor. To slaughter an animal was to lose a long-term source of survival, and so it was not done lightly. When meat did appear in a peasant's lunch, it was often in small amounts, carefully stretched to flavor a larger dish. A bit of salted pork, perhaps cut into tiny pieces and stirred into pottage, could turn an ordinary meal into something richer. Bacon, salted and hung for preservation, was prized for its fat, which gave flavor to otherwise plain grains and vegetables. On feast days or at special occasions, more substantial cuts might be eaten, but in daily life, most peasants could not expect meat to be a part of their lunch. Hunting, too, was largely out of reach for peasants. Forests were often controlled by nobles, and the laws of the land forbade common people from hunting deer, boar, or game birds in those woods. To do so was a crime, punished severely, sometimes even by death. Instead, peasants might catch rabbits, hares, or birds on their own land if fortunate, or they might trap fish in local streams. But even here, rights were often restricted. Rivers and ponds could be claimed by lords or monasteries, limiting access for ordinary people. Thus, while meat and fish were not unknown to peasants, they were limited, tightly controlled by both circumstance and law. For nobles, however, meat and fish were expected at lunch, symbols of abundance and refinement. A noble's midday meal might include roasted venison, fresh from the hunt, or capons prepared with sauces spiced with pepper, cloves, or cinnamon. Fish, too, appeared often, not only because of religious rules, but because it was a mark of wealth to have fresh or preserved fish brought to the table. Noble households might maintain their own fish ponds, carefully stocked with carp, trout, or eels. These ponds were more than sources of food. They were displays of prestige, showing control over both land and water. To eat well was to live well, and for nobles, meat and fish were the very heart of that display. Hunting was not only a way to secure meat, but also a noble pastime. The hunt was a social event, filled with ceremony, skill, and danger. To return from the forest with a stag or boar was not only to provide for the table, but also to demonstrate prowess and authority. At lunch, when venison was carved and served, it carried with it the weight of that ritual. Guests at a noble feast could not fail to notice the richness of the meat, nor the status it conferred upon their host. Meat was more than food, it was power on a plate. Fish, though, was shaped more directly by the rules of faith. The medieval church required fasting on many days of the year, during which meat from four-legged animals was forbidden. On these days, fish became essential. For monasteries, towns, and noble households alike, fish filled the gap left by meat. In coastal regions, fresh fish might be abundant, hauled in daily and sold at markets. Inland, however, fresh fish was harder to come by, and so preserved fish salted, smoked, or dried was more common. Herring, in particular, was a staple, preserved in barrels and shipped across Europe in vast quantities. Cod, too, was fished and preserved, becoming a familiar taste at tables far from the sea. In monasteries, fish played a central role in daily meals. Since monks often avoided meat entirely, fish provided a key source of protein. Some monasteries maintained elaborate fish ponds, carefully managed to ensure a steady supply throughout the year. At lunch, monks might eat eels, carp, or other freshwater fish, sometimes simply boiled, sometimes flavored with herbs or sauces. Though plain compared to noble dishes, these meals were steady and sustaining, forming part of the quiet rhythm of monastic life. What is striking is how the same foods carried such different meanings depending on class. For peasants, a small scrap of salted pork stirred into pottage was a treasure. For nobles, a roasted capon or venison stew was expected. For monks, fish was a discipline of faith. The presence or absence of meat and fish at lunch told everyone who you were and what life you lived. It marked the line between survival and display, between necessity and abundance. The preservation of meat and fish also played a role in shaping lunch. Without refrigeration, medieval people relied on salting, smoking, and drying to keep food edible. A salted herring might travel hundreds of miles before reaching a table, its taste sharp with brine, but welcome nonetheless. Bacon and ham, salted and hung in cottages, could be sliced and eaten long after slaughter, providing flavor across the seasons. Fresh meat, when it appeared, was a luxury to be savored quickly before it spoiled. Lunch in the Middle Ages was shaped not only by class and custom, but by these practical realities of preservation and storage. Festivals and feast days were moments when the ordinary rules shifted. At Christmas, Easter, or during harvest celebrations, peasants might enjoy meat more freely, sharing in the abundance of the season. Nobles, of course, multiplied their feasts during these times, serving elaborate dishes of swan, peacock, or even porpoise. At such moments, lunch became not just a meal, but a performance of community, wealth, and belief. Meat and fish, rare in daily life for many, were at the heart of these special occasions, making them unforgettable. Imagine now the contrast at midday. A peasant sitting in the fields breaks a crust of bread and dips it into a thin pottage flavored with a scrap of bacon fat. A monk in his cloistered refectory eats boiled carp in silence, the voice of scripture filling the air. A noble sits at a long table, slicing into roasted venison, wine at his elbow, musicians playing softly in the hall. Three very different lunches, yet all bound by the same need for sustenance, the same desire for nourishment, and the same connection to the world of animals and rivers, forests and seas. Meat and fish at lunch remind us that the medieval table was never only about hunger. It was about hierarchy, faith, and the fragile balance between plenty and want. For some, the midday meal was plain and modest. For others, it was rich and abundant. But for all, the presence of meat or fish was never taken for granted. It was a gift of the land and the waters, shaped by toil, law, and faith, and it made lunch in the Middle Ages not only a meal, but a reflection of the world itself. After bread, pottage, and the occasional appearance of meat or fish, another vital element of the medieval lunch was dairy. Cheese, butter, and milk, in its various forms, were woven into the fabric of daily meals, especially for peasants and monks, though nobles enjoyed them as well. Dairy products were more than mere additions. They were essential sources of nourishment, capable of being stored, traded, or transformed into foods that lasted well beyond the fleeting freshness of milk. To picture a medieval lunch without dairy would be to miss one of the quiet but steady presences on the table. Milk itself, though plentiful from cows, goats, and sheep, was not often consumed fresh by adults. Children sometimes drank it, but for most people, milk was quickly turned into other products before it spoiled. Without modern refrigeration, milk soured rapidly, especially in the warmth of summer. This meant that transforming it into butter or cheese was both practical and necessary. For peasants, a cow or a goat could provide a steady supply of nourishment, its milk becoming cheese that might last for weeks, or butter that flavored otherwise plain bread. In this way, dairy was not only food, but also preservation, a means of stretching nature's gifts into the rhythm of daily life. Cheese was the most common and most versatile dairy product of the Middle Ages. It appeared at nearly every level of society, though its quality and style varied. For peasants, cheese was usually simple, made at home from goats' or cow's milk, often tangy, crumbly, and eaten fresh. It might be coarse by noble standards, but it was filling and rich in protein, making it a vital companion to bread at lunch. A hunk of bread and a piece of cheese could sustain a laborer through hours of work in the fields. Cheese could also be stored and aged, allowing families to keep food for leaner times. Harder cheeses might be grated into pottage, while softer cheeses were eaten directly, often with onions or herbs for added flavor. In monasteries, cheese held a central place as well. Since monks often avoided meat, cheese provided protein in its stead. Monasteries with herds of cows, goats, or sheep produced their own cheeses, which varied from simple soft cheeses to more developed, aged forms. Lunch in a monastery might include bread, pottage, and a portion of cheese, eaten in silence but savored nonetheless. The making of cheese was itself sometimes part of monastic labor, tying the rhythms of faith to the rhythms of production and nourishment. Cheese in monasteries was not only food, but a symbol of self-sufficiency, a reminder that the community could sustain itself through its own careful work. For nobles, cheese was both common and refined. Wealthy households had access to finer varieties, sometimes imported from distant regions, such as Parmesan from Italy, which was already known in the later Middle Ages. Noble tables might feature cheese as part of a course, served with fruits, nuts, and wine. Recipes from noble cookbooks also show cheese used in pies, pastries, and sauces, blending it with spices and sugar to create luxurious dishes. While peasants ate cheese as a matter of necessity, Nobles enjoyed it as a matter of taste, transforming the same humble product into something elegant and celebratory. Butter, too, was a vital presence, though its place varied depending on geography. In Northern Europe, butter was more common, especially in the British Isles and Scandinavia, where the climate supported cattle herding. Peasants used butter to flavor bread or to cook simple dishes, and for many, it was one of the few fats available. Butter also stored better than fresh milk, making it practical as well as delicious. In wealthier households, butter was used generously in cooking, producing richer, more flavorful meals. However, in Southern Europe, olive oil often replaced butter, reflecting the crops and climate of the region. Thus, whether butter or oil appeared at lunch depended not only on class, but also on geography. The place of butter in religious practice is also worth noting. On many fasting days, when meat and dairy were restricted, butter was forbidden alongside milk and cheese. In regions where butter was a daily staple, this created tension, leading some monasteries and churches to allow exceptions for health or practicality. In fact, in later centuries, dispensations were sometimes sold by church authorities, permitting the use of butter even during fasts, a reminder of how deeply woven dairy was into daily life. Beyond cheese and butter, other dairy products also found their way into lunch. Cream, when available, enriched sauces or desserts for nobles. Curdled milk, called curds, could be eaten fresh with bread. In some regions, sour milk drinks were consumed, especially by poorer folk, as nothing could be wasted. Every form of milk was transformed into something useful, reflecting the ingenuity of a world that relied on making the most of what was at hand. Dairy was also deeply social. For peasants, the sharing of cheese at lunch was a sign of community, a way of binding families together in the midst of toil. For monks, dairy at lunch was part of the shared rhythm of the cloister, eaten together in silence, but uniting the brothers in their common discipline. For nobles, cheese and butter appeared at banquets as marks of refinement, part of a display meant to impress guests. Thus, the same food could be humble, spiritual, or luxurious, depending on context. The symbolism of dairy also extended into language and culture. Cheese and butter were associated with prosperity in many regions, and cheese-making was often seen as a mark of household skill. Proverbs and sayings spoke of bread and cheese as symbols of simple sufficiency. In times of hardship, to have even bread and cheese was to have enough, a modest but secure meal that sustained life. Imagine, then, the many tables of lunch across the Middle Ages. A peasant worker pauses in the field, breaking bread and cutting a piece of sharp, homemade cheese, washing it down with a drink of ale. In the cloistered monastery, monks eat in silence, their plates holding bread, pottage, and a small serving of cheese from their own herds. In a castle hall, nobles dine on pastries filled with cheese, followed by plates of fruit, accompanied by buttered bread served on fine trenchers. Each scene reveals a different world, yet all share the presence of dairy, steady and sustaining. Cheese, butter, and milk products were not the stars of the medieval lunch, but they were always there in the background, quiet companions to bread and pottage. They remind us that medieval meals were not only about grandeur or scarcity, but also about the daily effort to preserve, transform, and share the gifts of the land. In the steady presence of dairy, we see both the practicality and the richness of medieval life, carried across tables humble and grand alike. If bread and pottage were the foundation of medieval lunch, and dairy provided its steady support, then vegetables and legumes added variety, texture, and balance. Today, vegetables are a central part of most meals, but in the Middle Ages, their role was shaped by season, class, and necessity. For peasants, vegetables and legumes were essential, affordable, abundant, and filling. For nobles, they were often considered humble foods, best suited for the poor, though they still found their way into the kitchens of castles, especially when paired with rich sauces or spices. To understand medieval lunch, we must see how vegetables and legumes sustained life across fields, towns, and monasteries. For the peasant household, vegetables were the daily companion of bread and pottage. Grown in small gardens near cottages or gathered from hedgerows and fields, they provided nourishment that the land itself seemed to offer freely. Onions, leeks, and cabbages were among the most common, hardy crops that could be grown in many climates and stored through colder months. Turnips and parsnips filled the same role, offering bulk and flavor when other foods were scarce. Beans and peas, dried for storage, were invaluable, able to last through the winter and added to stews and pottages to make them hearty and protein-rich. Lentils, though less common in northern Europe, were important in the south and were traded across regions. These foods filled the peasant's pot day after day, changing only with the cycle of the seasons. Their reliance on vegetables was practical but also cultural. To eat vegetables was not simply to eat what was available, but to live within the rhythm of the land. In spring, young greens like spinach and beet leaves might appear. In summer, peas, beans, and herbs gave freshness to the table. Autumn brought the bounty of root crops, onions, and late cabbages, while winter meals relied on dried legumes and stored vegetables. This cycle marked the turning of the year as much as festivals or church feasts. A peasant's lunch of bread, cheese, and a vegetable pottage was not only simple, but profoundly tied to the earth's rhythm, a living calendar of food. For nobles, vegetables carried a more complicated place. They were certainly eaten, but they were rarely the star of the meal. To serve a dish of beans or cabbage alone would have been considered too plain for the noble table. Instead, vegetables were paired with meats, blended into sauces, or flavored with imported spices to elevate them beyond their humble origins. Noble cookbooks show recipes for peas cooked with saffron, carrots simmered with honey, or cabbages prepared with pork fat and almond milk. These combinations turned ordinary ingredients into refined dishes, signaling that even the simplest foods could be transformed by wealth and skill. Still, there remained a sense among the wealthy that vegetables were foods for the poor, suitable only when prepared with care and luxury. Monasteries, once again, occupied a middle ground. Bound by rules that often restricted meat, monks relied heavily on vegetables and legumes for their midday meals. Lentils, beans, and peas were staples in monastic kitchens, cooked into thick stews or served with bread and cheese. Cabbages and onions grew in monastery gardens, tended by the brothers themselves, and were eaten daily. The emphasis was on moderation, with meals designed to sustain without indulgence. Vegetables, with their simplicity and abundance, fit this rule well. In fact, many monasteries became skilled in the cultivation of gardens, producing herbs and vegetables, not only for their own use, but for the wider community. In the quiet cloister, the steaming bowl of pea or lentil pottage was both a meal and an expression of discipline. The importance of legumes cannot be overstated. In an age when meat was scarce for many and often restricted by religious fasts, beans and peas provided much-needed protein. They were sometimes called the meat of the poor, offering strength and sustenance when other foods were unavailable. Dried and stored, they could last through long winters, carried from harvest to harvest. At lunch, they formed the base of countless dishes, filling bowls and bodies with warmth and strength. To eat legumes was to live within the cycle of necessity, to draw on foods that could endure when others failed. Herbs also played their part, adding flavor to otherwise plain meals. Peasants used what grew: wild parsley, sage, thyme, garlic, nettles, and even dandelion leaves. Nobles, with more resources, might use exotic spices alongside herbs, creating complex flavors that blended the local with the imported. Monasteries often cultivated extensive herb gardens, not only for cooking but for medicine, blurring the line between food and healing. A simple herb added to a midday stew might not only improve the taste, but also reflect centuries of knowledge about plants, health, and the body. The cultural view of vegetables also reveals much about medieval attitudes toward food. While peasants depended on them daily, nobles sometimes dismissed them as humble fare, a necessity rather than a luxury. To serve vegetables at a feast, without dressing them in sauces or spices, was unthinkable. Yet at the same time, medical theory of the period, based on the ancient concept of humors, often recommended vegetables as part of a balanced diet. Doctors and scholars wrote about which foods were hot or cold, moist or dry, and how they should be eaten to maintain health. In this way, vegetables were not only everyday sustenance, but part of the broader understanding of well-being. Imagine now the lunch tables across society. A peasant woman ladles out a thick pottage of beans and onions, the steam rising as her family dips bread into the bowl. A monk sits in the refectory, eating a cabbage and lentil stew, his thoughts lifted by scripture as much as by food. A noble feasts on roasted meat, but alongside it appear dishes of peas scented with saffron, carrots sweetened with honey, and cabbage simmered with pork fat, transformed into delicacies by wealth and skill. In all these scenes, vegetables and legumes stand quietly in the background, sometimes humble, sometimes refined, but always present. The enduring presence of vegetables in the medieval lunch reminds us that survival was built on what the earth could provide. In times of plenty, the fields and gardens filled pots and bowls with variety. In times of scarcity, the dried beans in the storehouse could mean the difference between endurance and hunger. Vegetables and legumes were not glamorous, but they were dependable, and in a world of uncertainty, that was perhaps their greatest gift. Thus, as we look at lunch in the Middle Ages, vegetables remind us of both humility and resilience. They grounded the peasant in the soil, they tested the creativity of the noble cook, and they sustained the monk in his discipline. Quiet, steady, and ever-present, they were the green heart of the medieval table. Among the many foods that appeared at the medieval lunch, fruit held a special place. Unlike bread, pottage, or cheese, fruit was not always a daily staple, but when it was present, it brought sweetness, freshness, and variety to the table. Its role depended on the season, the region, and above all, the class of the people who ate it. For peasants, fruit was often gathered or grown locally, eaten fresh when available, or dried and stored for later. For nobles, fruit could be both a simple pleasure and a symbol of refinement, often transformed into elaborate dishes with sugar and spices. For monks and clergy, fruit was a natural and welcome part of their moderate meals, tied to the rhythm of gardens and orchards. To understand lunch in the Middle Ages, we must look at how fruit shaped both daily eating and cultural meaning. The most common fruits in Europe were those that grew naturally in orchards, hedges, and fields: apples, pears, cherries, plums, and berries of all kinds. These fruits were eaten fresh in season, but they were also dried, preserved, or cooked into dishes to extend their usefulness. For peasants, apples and pears were particularly important, as they could be stored in cellars or lofts through the colder months. A peasant's lunch might occasionally include a fresh apple eaten with bread and cheese, or dried fruits saved for the leaner times of winter. Berries, gathered in the woods or hedgerows, were eaten fresh in summer, their sweetness a treat amid the plainness of daily meals. These fruits were not luxuries, but gifts of the land, available to those who knew where to look. For nobles, fruit was both more varied and more carefully prepared. Wealthy households had orchards of their own, producing apples, pears, cherries, and plums in abundance. They also had access to imported fruits, such as figs, dates, and raisins, carried across long trade routes from the Mediterranean and beyond. These exotic fruits were expensive and precious, appearing at noble lunches as signs of wealth and sophistication. A noble feast might include pears poached in wine, apples baked with spices, or dried figs served with nuts and honey. Cookbooks from the period include recipes for fruit tarts, spiced stews of prunes and raisins, and sauces made from fruits blended with vinegar, sugar, and herbs. These dishes elevated fruit from simple nourishment to culinary art, transforming the orchard's gifts into statements of status. Monasteries, once again, reflected a balance between abundance and restraint. Many monasteries cultivated orchards as part of their self-sufficient economy, producing apples, pears, and plums for their own use and for trade. Fruit often appeared at lunch in simple forms, eaten fresh or stewed, especially on fasting days when meat was forbidden. Dried fruits, such as raisins and figs, were valued for their ability to last through the winter and to provide sweetness in moderation. For monks, fruit was both sustenance and a reminder of the natural cycles of creation, tied to the rhythm of prayer, labor, and the seasons. A preservation of fruit was an important part of medieval life. Without refrigeration, people relied on drying, fermenting, or cooking fruits to keep them edible. Apples and pears could be dried in thin slices. Raisins and figs traveled across continents in sacks, and prunes, dried plums, became a staple of trade and cooking. Honey was often used to preserve fruits, coating them in sweetness and sealing them against spoilage. Later in the Middle Ages, sugar imported from the Mediterranean and eventually from far-off plantations began to replace honey in noble households, creating candied fruits and syrups that were prized luxuries. At lunch, a noble might be served preserved quinces or candied orange peel, while a peasant might chew on a handful of dried apples or plums saved from autumn. The symbolism of fruit also mattered. In Christian culture, fruit carried deep associations with temptation, paradise, and knowledge. Apples, in particular, held a place in the imagination as the fruit of the Garden of Eden, though the Bible never specifies which fruit it was. In medieval art, fruits often symbolized abundance, fertility, or moral lessons. On the table, they were not only food, but reminders of both the bounty and the fragility of life. To bite into a pear or apple at lunch was to taste the sweetness of creation itself, a small miracle in a world of labor and uncertainty. Fruit also played a role in beverages. Apples and pears, when fermented, became cider and perry, common drinks in many parts of Europe. These beverages often accompanied lunch, especially for peasants who could not afford wine. Grapes, of course, were essential for wine production, and though fresh grapes were enjoyed at the table, their true significance lay in the vineyards that covered vast areas of medieval Europe. Wine was the noble's drink, cider the peasants', but both had their roots in the fruits of the earth. The ways fruit was eaten also highlight class differences. For peasants, fruit was eaten simply, often raw or dried, without elaborate preparation. It was an occasional treat, not the centerpiece of a meal. For nobles, fruit was almost always altered, cooked, or combined with other flavors to show refinement. To serve raw fruit was sometimes considered crude, though exceptions existed. Instead, fruits were baked into pies, boiled into sauces, or sweetened into compotes. This distinction reflected the broader pattern of medieval cuisine, where wealth was shown not only by what was eaten, but by how it was prepared. Picture the medieval lunch tables once more. In the field, a peasant takes out a small bundle, containing bread, a wedge of cheese, and a few dried plums, chewing slowly before returning to work. In the monastery, a monk eats stewed apples from the orchard, softened and warmed, their sweetness simple and satisfying. In a noble hall, a servant places before the lord a dish of pears poached in spiced wine, garnished with sugar, and almonds, the fruit transformed into a delicate expression of wealth. Each scene shows fruit in its own form, humble or refined, yet always a source of sweetness and strength. The presence of fruit at lunch also reminds us of the delicate balance between scarcity and abundance. In years of good harvests, orchards and vineyards yielded richly, filling cellars and kitchens. In years of poor weather or blight, fruit was scarce, and its absence was felt keenly. To have fruit at the table was to taste the success of the season, the health of the land, and the fragile gift of nature's bounty. In this way, fruit was never taken for granted, for it could not be summoned at will. It was a gift of time, weather, and fortune, and to eat it was to savor the fleeting sweetness of life. Thus, fruit at lunch in the Middle Ages was more than food. It was a reflection of class, culture, and faith, a sign of the seasons and the cycles of the earth. Fresh or dried, humble or refined, it added color, sweetness, and meaning to the midday meal. To taste fruit at lunch was to taste both the earth's generosity and its limits, a reminder that every bite was a gift carried across time and place. No meal in the Middle Ages was complete without something to drink, and lunch was no exception. In a world without modern sanitation or refrigeration, water was often distrusted, thought to carry illness, or simply too plain for daily enjoyment. Instead, people of all classes turned to drinks that were fermented, brewed, or pressed from fruits and grains. Ale, cider, and wine became the everyday companions of bread, cheese, and pottage, each shaping the rhythm of lunch depending on region, wealth, and tradition. To understand medieval lunch, we must also raise a cup and consider what people drank at the midday table. For peasants, ale was the most common drink. Made from barley or oats, sometimes flavored with herbs, ale was brewed in households and villages alike. It was a staple, as essential as bread, and often consumed throughout the day. Unlike the strong beers of today, medieval ale was typically low in alcohol, sometimes referred to as small ale. This made it safe to drink in large amounts, quenching thirst and providing calories without the dangers of untreated water. At lunch, a peasant might drink ale brewed at home by his wife or daughter, since brewing was often considered a domestic task. In many villages, women known as alewives supplied their neighbors with drink, selling from their doors or at markets. Ale was inexpensive, filling, and deeply woven into the daily life of the common people. Cider, made from apples or pears, was another common drink, especially in regions where orchards flourished. In England, France, and parts of Germany, cider was brewed in villages and farms, filling the same role as ale in quenching thirst and providing nourishment. Like ale, cider could be weak and refreshing, or stronger and more intoxicating, depending on how it was made. For peasants, cider was often seasonal, most abundant after the apple harvest in autumn, but it could be stored in barrels to last through the year. At lunch in these regions, a cup of cider was a natural companion to bread, cheese, and vegetables, a drink drawn directly from the bounty of the land. Wine, though, was the noble's drink. Across much of southern and western Europe, vineyards spread across hillsides, producing grapes that were pressed into wine for both daily consumption and trade. For nobles and wealthy merchants, wine was expected at lunch, served in goblets and poured by attendants. It could be red, white, or rose, and it was often flavored with spices, or sweetened with honey or sugar for added refinement. While nobles drank wine as a mark of their status, it was not entirely absent from peasant life. In wine-growing regions, even common folk might drink weaker wines or diluted versions, though the best vintages were reserved for the wealthy. Wine was also central to religious life, used in the Eucharist, and so it carried spiritual as well as social meaning. Monasteries were also closely tied to drink, especially wine and ale. Many monasteries cultivated vineyards, producing wine both for their own use and for sale, helping to sustain their communities. Monks were skilled in brewing too, and in some regions, monasteries became centers of ale production, known for their quality and care. At lunch in a monastery, a monk might drink ale or wine depending on location and resources, but always in moderation, for excess was discouraged. Still, the presence of these drinks at the monastic table reveals how deeply they were woven into medieval life, even in communities dedicated to simplicity and restraint. The preparation and storage of drinks also shaped their role at lunch. Ale was brewed often, since it did not keep well and would sour after a few days. This meant that fresh ale was a constant rhythm of life, always being made, consumed, and remade. Cider lasted longer in barrels, and wine could be aged, though much of it was drunk young and fresh. The flavors of these drinks varied greatly from what we know today, often cloudy, sour, or flavored with herbs. Yet they were cherished not for refinement, but for reliability. They were safe to drink, nourishing, and filling. For nobles, drinks at lunch could also be a display of wealth and sophistication. Imported wines from regions such as Bordeaux or Burgundy were prized, and the ability to serve rare vintages impressed guests. Spiced wine, known as hippocras, was a particular favorite, blending red or white wine with cinnamon, cloves, ginger, and sugar. It was often served at the end of a meal, but it could appear at lunch as well, adding a note of luxury and exotic flavor. In this way, even drink became a performance of status, just as much as the meats and sauces on the table. For peasants, drink was more modest, but no less important. The midday pause in the fields often included a flask of ale or cider, carried from home and shared among workers. These drinks provided both refreshment and calories, essential for bodies bent to labor under the sun. To drink together was to rest together, a moment of relief before the work resumed. In towns, taverns and alehouses offered drink for purchase, providing craftsmen, merchants, and travelers with a place to pause for their midday meal. These establishments became social centers where news and gossip flowed as freely as ale. Water, though distrusted, was not entirely absent. In some regions, clear springs or wells provided safe water, and people did drink it, especially when nothing else was available. But it was never the preferred drink at lunch, except perhaps for monks or those who had no other choice. In most cases, ale, cider, or wine were safer and more satisfying. Even children drank these weaker versions, though always in moderation. Thus, the act of drinking at lunch was not only about quenching thirst, but also about living within the practical and cultural realities of the time. Imagine once more the different lunch tables. A peasant, sitting in the shade of a tree, takes a swig of ale from a wooden flask, washing down bread and cheese before returning to work. A monk, in the cool silence of the cloister, drinks a modest cup of wine as scripture is read aloud, the simple meal before him a reflection of both labor and devotion. A noble, reclining in his hall, sips from a goblet of spiced wine, servants refilling his cup as musicians play softly in the background. Each scene shows not only the food but the drink, shaping the meaning of lunch and binding it to class, place, and faith. Drinks at lunch in the Middle Ages remind us that nourishment was not only about eating. It was also about the flow of liquid that refreshed the body and marked the rhythms of life. Ale, cider, and wine were more than beverages. They were symbols of culture, community, and survival. To raise a cup at lunch was to join in the great cycle of medieval life, where every sip carried both necessity and meaning. When we imagine lunch in the Middle Ages, we often picture the foods themselves: bread, pottage, cheese, meat, or fish. Yet just as important as what people ate was how they ate it. The customs of the table, the tools or lack of tools, and the rules of behavior shaped the experience of lunch in every corner of medieval society. From the rough boards of a peasant's cottage to the long tables of a noble hall or the silent refectory of a monastery, the act of eating lunch was filled with habits, gestures, and expectations that revealed much about the culture of the time. For the peasant family, utensils were few and simple. Knives were the most common tool, carried by men and women alike as personal possessions. A knife might be used to cut bread, cheese, or meat when it was available, but much of the food could be eaten directly by hand. Bread itself often doubled as a tool, used to scoop pottage or to catch drippings. Spoons were known, often carved from wood or made of horn, but not every household had them in abundance. A family might share a few spoons, passing them between bowls when needed. Forks, however, were almost unknown in peasant households. Instead, food was grasped, torn, dipped, and shared, with hands considered perfectly acceptable instruments at the table. For peasants, eating was practical rather than ceremonial, and customs reflected the need to make the most of what was available. Nobles, by contrast, placed much greater importance on table manners and the rituals of eating. Here, too, knives were essential, often more finely made, with decorated handles or blades. Each noble might carry his or her own knife, using it both for dining and for daily tasks. Spoons of metal or fine wood were also common in noble households, and by the later Middle Ages, forks began to appear in some places, though they were not yet widespread. At noble lunches, food was often served on trenchers-thick slices of stale bread or on wooden, pewter, or silver plates. The trencher absorbed juices and sauces, and at the end of the meal it could be eaten, given to servants, or distributed to the poor. Hands were still used, but nobles were expected to eat delicately, using bread or knives to avoid mésalliances. Manuals of courtesy from the period instructed diners to keep their fingers clean, to avoid putting both hands into the same dish, and to wipe their mouths before drinking from shared cups. Thus, even while eating with hands, rules of refinement shaped the act into something more than mere survival. Monks in monasteries followed their own customs, marked by discipline and simplicity. Meals were taken in silence, often with a reader reciting scripture while the brothers ate. Food was served communally, and utensils were modest. Wooden spoons and simple knives sufficed, with bread often serving as both plate and tool. The focus was not on display or elegance, but on humility and uniformity. Eating at lunch was an act of necessity, carried out with restraint and in harmony with spiritual life. Even so, the customs of the refectory emphasized order. Monks sat in assigned places, ate together, and observed rules designed to prevent waste or indulgence. The manner of eating was itself a reflection of the vows they lived by. The sharing of dishes was another key aspect of medieval eating customs. Individual plates or bowls were not always provided, especially among peasants and in many noble households. Instead, two or more people might share a dish, dipping bread or spoons into the same pottage or carving meat from the same platter. This practice fostered a sense of community, but also required etiquette. Manuals of courtesy reminded nobles not to take the choicest pieces for themselves, not to dip food back into a communal sauce once bitten, and to take care when carving to offer portions generously to others. In this way, lunch was not only about feeding the body, but also about performing social bonds, showing respect, generosity, and awareness of one's place at the table. Washing hands before and after meals was an important custom, especially in noble households. Servants would bring basins of water and towels so diners could clean themselves before sitting down. After eating, hands were washed again to remove grease or stains from food. This practice was practical, given the use of hands in dining, but it also carried symbolic weight, marking the meal as a ritual with a beginning and an end. Among peasants, hand-washing was more modest, often carried out with a jug of water at the door or a cloth kept near the table. In monasteries, cleanliness was part of discipline, ensuring order and respect in all things. Drinking customs also shaped lunch. Cups or goblets were often shared, especially among peasants, with family members drinking from the same vessel. Nobles might have more individualized cups, though even at noble feasts, sharing was not unusual. Courtesy dictated that one wipe the rim of the cup before passing it on, a small gesture of respect that appears again and again in medieval courtesy books. In monasteries, cups of wine or ale were distributed with care, and drinking was done quietly, in keeping with the silence of the meal. The customs of eating also extended to posture and behavior. Peasants might sit on benches or stools around a rough wooden board, while nobles dined at long trestle tables in great halls. Lords and ladies were often seated on raised platforms, emphasizing their status, while servants and lesser guests sat lower. At noble lunches, conversation and entertainment often accompanied the meal, though even here, rules of courtesy applied. One was not to speak with a mouth full of food, to reach across the table rudely, or to show greed. Monks, in contrast, sat in rows, facing one another, eating in silence with their focus turned inward to prayer and discipline. Each setting carried its own meaning, transforming the simple act of eating into a reflection of social order. Despite these differences, some customs were shared across society. The breaking of bread, the passing of food, the use of hands, and the importance of sharing linked all levels of life. To eat lunch in the Middle Ages was to take part in a ritual that was both physical and social, shaped by necessity but also by culture. Even the humblest peasant knew the rules of sharing and the importance of fairness at the table, just as the wealthiest noble understood that food was also a performance of generosity and refinement. Imagine now the many tables of lunch once more. In a cottage, a peasant family dips bread into a shared bowl of pottage, knives cutting rough slices of cheese, spoons scraping the last drops. In a monastery, monks sit in silence, their wooden spoons moving steadily, the voice of a reader rising above the clink of bowls. In a castle hall, nobles lean over trenchers, carving meat with elegant knives, servants bringing basins to wash their hands, musicians playing softly in the background. Each table is different, yet all are bound by customs that turn the act of eating into something more than survival. Lunch was not only about food, but about the way it was eaten, the gestures and habits that made it a part of daily life. In this way, utensils, hands, and customs remind us that the medieval lunch was both familiar and strange. To eat with hands seems crude to us, yet it was guided by rules of courtesy. To share dishes might feel unusual today, yet it was a sign of trust and community. The medieval table was a mirror of its society, reflecting class, faith, and fellowship in every gesture. Lunch in the Middle Ages, whether in a cottage, cloister, or castle, was never just about filling the stomach. It was about living within the order of the world, and that order was made visible in the customs of the table. To truly picture the medieval lunch, we must step into the shoes of the peasant, the men and women who made up the vast majority of the population. Their days were marked by unrelenting labor, their bodies bent to the soil, their hours governed by the seasons, and their meals shaped by necessity rather than choice. For the working peasant, lunch was not a leisurely pause or an elaborate display, but a quick, filling, and necessary act of survival. It was the fuel that allowed them to keep going through long afternoons of toil. Though often simple and repetitive, the peasant's midday meal was central to their lives, carrying with it both hardship and resilience. The morning for a peasant began early, often before the sun rose. Fields had to be plowed, animals tended, wood gathered, and tools readied. Many peasants went hours without eating after waking, their first true meal coming not at dawn, but closer to midday. When the church bell signaled sext, or when the sun reached its peak, work was briefly set aside for food. This was lunch, the meal that gave strength for the second half of the day when the body most needed renewal. To go without it meant exhaustion, and so even the poorest households made some provision for it, however meager. What did this lunch look like? At its simplest, it was bread, coarse and dark, baked from barley, rye, or oats, sometimes flavored with bran or peas to stretch the flour further. Alongside bread might come a piece of cheese, sharp and tangy, cut from a wheel made at home. If the family was fortunate, there might be onions, leeks, or beans to add flavor. A pottage prepared earlier could be carried to the fields in a pot or consumed at home, thickened with grains and whatever vegetables were at hand. A bit of bacon fat stirred in could transform the taste, making it richer and more sustaining. But often there was little meat, and rarely more than a scrap or bone to flavor the pot. The meal was plain, but it was enough to fill the stomach and restore the body for further work. The setting of lunch for peasants was rarely grand. In the summer months, it might be eaten in the fields, workers sitting on the ground beneath the sun, sharing from a cloth bundle or a small pot. In winter, it might be taken in a simple cottage, where smoke from the hearth filled the air and children gathered close to share in the meal. Lunch was not a moment of ceremony, but of practicality. Hands grasping bread, knives slicing onions, flasks of ale or cider passed between them. It was food eaten quickly, often with conversation about the day's labor, the weather, or the tasks yet to come. Despite its simplicity, the peasant's lunch had meaning. It was a pause in a life of unending work, a moment of togetherness for families and neighbors. To break bread at midday was to affirm survival, to acknowledge the gift of nourishment in a world where hunger was never far away. Even a crust of bread and a sip of ale carried weight, for it was the assurance of another few hours of strength. In this way, lunch was both humble and profound, a daily act of endurance that bound communities together. The quality of a peasant's lunch could vary greatly, depending on fortune, harvest, and season. In times of plenty, the meal might be richer vegetables abundant from the garden, cheese plentiful from the herd, perhaps even a small portion of salted fish or pork. In times of scarcity, lunch might shrink to little more than bread and water, with perhaps a handful of beans to sustain. Famines, when they came, stripped lunch down to its barest form, and records from the Middle Ages describe desperate measures. Bread stretched with acorns or chestnut flour, meals reduced to thin, cruel hunger gnawing, even as the bell rang for sext. For peasants, the memory of hunger was constant, shaping their gratitude when food was plentiful and their fear when it was not. Ale or cider almost always accompanied lunch, especially in regions where these drinks were staples. A small flask might be carried to the fields, shared among workers as they ate. These drinks provided not only refreshment, but also calories, helping to sustain energy through long hours of labor. For children, weaker versions were common, ensuring even the youngest had safe liquids to drink. In this way, drink was as essential to the peasant's lunch as bread itself. A social aspect of lunch should not be overlooked. Though work was demanding, peasants often paused together, sharing food in groups. Neighbors might sit side by side in the fields, pulling bread from the same loaf, dipping into the same pottage. Families ate together when possible, passing food from hand to hand, each member taking their share. This communal act reinforced bonds of trust and cooperation, necessary for survival in villages where everyone's labor supported the whole. Lunch was not a time of isolation, but of fellowship, however brief. For children and the elderly, lunch was equally vital. Children, who often helped in the fields or with household chores, needed the nourishment to grow and endure the work. The elderly, less able to labor, but still part of the household, shared in the meal, their presence reminding younger generations of continuity and endurance. Thus, lunch was not only fuel for labor, but a moment of intergenerational connection, binding families together around the table or in the fields. It is tempting to see the peasant's lunch as monotonous, but within its simplicity lay resilience. The reliance on bread, pottage, and cheese did not mean a lack of creativity. Herbs were gathered to flavor dishes, vegetables were varied by season, and even the humblest meals could shift in taste with what the land provided. The ingenuity of peasants turned necessity into a kind of art, making the most of scarce resources and creating meals that, though plain, were sustaining and meaningful. Picture now the scene of a peasant lunch. The sun is high and the fields stretch wide. A man and his family sit on the grass, their tools laid aside for a moment. A cloth is opened, revealing bread, cheese, and onions. A flask of ale is passed, each taking a drink before returning it. Children chew on crusts, their laughter mingling with the calls of birds. The meal is short, but it is enough. Soon, the tools will be taken up again, the work resumed, but for this brief moment, life pauses, and lunch provides its gift of strength. In the end, the peasant's lunch reminds us that even the simplest meals can carry deep meaning. It was not about variety or luxury, but about survival, community, and endurance. It sustained the body, strengthened the bonds of family and village, and marked the rhythm of days that were otherwise consumed by labor. Quick, filling, and necessary, lunch for the peasant was life itself, carried in bread, pottage, cheese, and ale. Though humble, it was enough to keep the medieval world turning, one midday meal at a time. If the peasant's lunch was marked by necessity and the noble's lunch by display, then the monastery's midday meal was defined by rules, silence, and simplicity. For monks across medieval Europe, life was not shaped by wealth or poverty in the same way as the wider world, but by devotion, prayer, and the structure of the religious rule they followed. Lunch, though a time for nourishment, was never simply about food. It was an extension of spiritual discipline, an act performed with restraint, order, and awareness of the sacred. To imagine lunch in a monastery is to imagine a meal where silence was as important as bread, and where simplicity was itself a form of devotion. The timing of lunch in monasteries was carefully set. The day was divided into canonical hours, each marked by prayer, and the meal came after the service of sext, around midday. This rhythm meant that the meal was not only a pause from labor, but also a continuation of spiritual practice. It was not indulgence but necessity, granted at the proper time, and always framed by prayer. The ringing of the bell summoned the monks from their fields, workshops, or studies into the refectory, where the meal would be taken in strict order. The refectory itself was a central space in the monastery. Long wooden tables stretched down the hall, with benches on either side. At one end might be a pulpit or raised platform where a reader would stand. For in many monasteries, silence was observed during meals, and a monk would read aloud from scripture, saints' lives, or moral texts while the others ate. This practice ensured that even while the body was fed, the mind and spirit were also nourished. To eat in silence while hearing sacred words was to join the physical act of eating with the spiritual act of contemplation. The food served at lunch was modest, but sustaining. Bread was always present, baked in the monastery's ovens from the grain harvested in its fields. Pottage made from beans, peas, lentils, or vegetables was common, thick and filling, flavored with herbs from the monastery garden. Fish, especially in regions where monasteries maintained fish ponds, often appeared as well, boiled or baked, providing protein in place of meat. For many orders, meat from four-legged animals was forbidden, considered too indulgent and too closely tied to the pleasures of the flesh. Poultry might be allowed, but fish was more common, aligning with the many fasting rules of the church. Cheese and butter, produced from the monastery's own herds, might accompany the meal, adding variety without extravagance. On feast days or during times of celebration, the meal might be richer, but even then, it was never excessive. Simplicity was the guiding principle. The portion of food given to each monk was regulated. The rule of Saint Benedict, one of the most influential sets of monastic guidelines, specified limits on both the amount and type of food. Enough was to be given to sustain health and labor, but not so much as to encourage gluttony. Moderation was the goal, reflecting the monastic vow of self-denial and balance. Wine was permitted in moderation as well, though water or weak ale might be more common in certain regions. What mattered most was that meals were taken as part of a disciplined life, not as moments of indulgence. The silence of the meal carried great significance. To eat without speaking was to remind the monks that food was a gift, not an opportunity for distraction or idle talk. Conversation, which might lead to laughter, gossip, or quarrels, was set aside. Instead, the mind was directed toward the words being read aloud or toward private reflection. In some monasteries, monks communicated through gestures if they needed to request something, such as more bread or another spoon. This quiet orderliness set monastic meals apart from the noisy bustle of peasant cottages or the lively chatter of noble feasts. Lunch in the cloister was a practice of humility, silence, and discipline, reinforcing the spiritual focus of the community. Yet despite the rules and restraint, monastic lunch was not grim or joyless. There was comfort in the rhythm, satisfaction in the simplicity, and even pleasure in the fresh bread, warm pottage, or well-tended garden vegetables. For monks who labored in fields or workshops, lunch was a welcome pause, a chance to rest and renew strength. The discipline of the meal did not erase its humanity. Rather, it placed the act of eating within a sacred order, turning nourishment into an act of devotion. The shared meal bound the community together, just as prayer did, reminding each monk that he was part of a greater whole. Monasteries also played an important role in feeding others. Guests, travelers, and the poor were often given meals at monastery gates, a reflection of Christian charity. While the monks themselves ate modestly, those who came seeking food might be offered bread, pottage, or fish, ensuring that the monastery's abundance extended beyond its walls. Thus, the lunch of monks was not only for themselves, but for the wider world, a reminder that simplicity and generosity could coexist. The role of food in monasteries also reflected the seasons and the calendar of fasting. During Lent, Advent, and on many fast days throughout the year, meals became even more restrained. Meat was forbidden, and sometimes dairy as well, leaving bread, legumes, and vegetables as the core of lunch. These restrictions were not merely rules, but spiritual exercises, teaching discipline and reminding monks of the sacrifices of faith. The rhythm of feasting and fasting shaped monastic life just as much as prayer and work, and lunch reflected this cycle in its contents and customs. Imagine then the monastery at midday. The bell rings for sext, and monks file into the refectory, their sandals echoing softly on stone floors. They sit at long tables, their heads bowed in silence. A reader begins to recite from Scripture, his voice carrying over the room. Bowls of pottage are placed before them, along with bread and perhaps a small portion of fish. Wooden spoons lift in unison, hands break bread, cups are raised carefully to lips. No conversation breaks the quiet, only the steady rhythm of eating and the measured voice of the reader. The meal is simple, but it is enough. When it ends, prayers are said, and the monks return to their work, renewed in body and spirit alike. Lunch in monasteries reminds us that food is never just food. It is shaped by belief, by community, and by the rhythms of life. In the cloister, lunch was a practice of silence and simplicity, a reflection of the monastic vow to live apart from the world, yet always mindful of its needs. It shows us that the medieval lunch was not one thing but many, shifting with class, place, and purpose. For monks, it was never about indulgence, but about balanced bread, pottage, fish, and cheese, served not for pleasure, but for life and devotion. And in that balance, we glimpse a way of eating that was deeply human, deeply spiritual, and deeply tied to the world around it. If the peasant's lunch was humble, and the monk's lunch disciplined, the noble's midday meal was something else entirely, a display of wealth, power, and refinement. For the noble classes, lunch was not only a chance to eat, but an opportunity to demonstrate status, to impress guests, and to turn the act of dining into ceremony. Feasting was not reserved only for the evening. In many noble households, the midday meal was the main meal of the day, stretching across courses, attended by servants, and accompanied by ritual and entertainment. To imagine a noble as lunch is to imagine not only food, but theater or performance that conveyed authority as much as it satisfied hunger. The setting of a noble lunch was as important as the meal itself. In castles and manor houses, meals were taken in the great hall, A vast room lined with wooden tables, banners, and perhaps even tapestries. At one end of the hall sat the lord and his family, often raised on a dais to mark their higher status. Guests, knights, and important retainers might sit at nearby tables, while lesser servants and retainers sat further away. This arrangement reflected the rigid hierarchy of the medieval world, even at lunch. One's position at the table mirrored one's position in society. The physical space, the order of seating, and the presence of attendants all served to make the act of eating a visible demonstration of power. The food at a noble lunch was far more varied and luxurious than that of peasants or monks. Bread was still ever present, but it was fine white bread, manchet loaves baked from sifted wheat flour. Meat appeared in abundance: roasted beef, venison from the hunt, pork glazed with honey, or poultry such as capons and geese. Fish, too, was common, especially during fasting periods, with salmon, trout, or eels prepared with elaborate sauces. Unlike the simple pottages of peasants, noble pottages were enriched with almonds, saffron, or imported spices. Fruits and vegetables appeared as well, though often dressed with spices or sweeteners to make them suitable for the noble table. Courses followed one another, each dish designed to delight the palate and impress the eye. Spices played a central role in noble dining, especially at lunch. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, pepper, and ginger were imported at great expense, often from Asia, and their presence in a dish signaled wealth and sophistication. Sugar, too, though rare and costly, began to appear in noble kitchens, used to make candied fruits, sweet sauces, or spiced wines. These flavors were unfamiliar to peasants, who relied on herbs grown locally, but for nobles they became essential markers of refinement. A noble lunch was not simply about quantity, but about quality, variety, and the ability to transform ordinary foods into extraordinary creations. The structure of the meal often followed courses, with dishes brought out in sequence by servants. A first course might include soups, pottages, or lighter dishes to whet the appetite. The main course featured meats, fish, and substantial dishes, accompanied by sauces and breads. A final course might include fruit, nuts, pastries, or spiced wine. Each stage of the meal was carefully planned, and the order of dishes was itself a sign of refinement. To serve lunch in courses was to show mastery over abundance, to turn plenty into art. Ceremony surrounded the meal at every step. Before eating, nobles washed their hands, servants bringing basins and towels for the purpose. During the meal, carvers, cupbearers, and servers attended the lord and his guests, each with a designated role. Musicians might play in the background, their songs adding atmosphere to the hall. Entertainers, jesters, storytellers, or even trained animals might appear to amuse the company. The meal was not a private act, but a public one, filled with eyes, ears, and rituals designed to elevate eating into performance. Even the way nobles ate was shaped by courtesy and refinement. Manuals of etiquette advised them to chew quietly, to avoid using both hands at once, to offer food to others before taking it for themselves, and to use bread or knives rather than fingers directly when possible. While hands were still common at the table, the noble hand was expected to be delicate, not coarse. To eat gracefully was to demonstrate breeding, just as much as to wear fine clothes or speak in polished tones. Lunch thus became a lesson in manners, reinforcing the noble ideal of refinement. The presence of guests made noble lunches especially important. To invite someone to dine was to extend honor, and the richness of the table reflected the host's generosity and power. A lord who served abundant and varied dishes displayed his wealth. A lady who presided gracefully over the meal demonstrated refinement. For knights, clerics, and visiting dignitaries, the lunch table was a stage upon which alliances were formed, reputations built, and power displayed. Food was not only sustenance, but politics, eaten and shared with care. Yet, behind the grandeur, noble lunches also relied on the labor of many unseen hands. Servants prepared, cooked, and served the dishes, working in hot kitchens filled with smoke and heat. Hunters brought in game, fishermen supplied rivers and ponds, and farmers tilled the land that produced bread, vegetables, and cheese. The abundance at the noble table was built on the labor of peasants and workers, whose own lunches were far more modest. The contrast between the two was stark, and it made the noble meal not only a feast of food, but also a feast of privilege. Despite the display, noble lunches were not always lavish feasts. On ordinary days, the meal might be simpler, though still far richer than that of common folk. Bread, meat, and wine remained staples, even when fewer courses were served. The difference lay not in the presence of food, but in the scale of it. For nobles, even simplicity was luxurious compared to the daily fare of peasants. A roast chicken with fine bread and a cup of wine was an ordinary lunch for a noble, yet for a peasant it would have been a feast beyond imagining. Imagine now the great hall at midday. Sunlight streams through narrow windows, illuminating long tables set with trenchers of fine bread. Servants carry platters of roasted meat, bowls of spiced pottage, and goblets of wine. Musicians play softly in the corner, their lutes and flutes filling the air with melody. At the high table, the lord raises his cup, his guests waiting as servants carve venison and place it on their trenchers. Conversation hums, laughter rises, and the clatter of knives and spoons fills the hall. Lunch here is not only a meal, but an affirmation of power, wealth, and place in the world. The noble lunch reminds us that in the Middle Ages, food was never only about hunger. It was about status, ritual, and community. For nobles, lunch was as much a display as it was nourishment, a chance to demonstrate refinement through abundance, courtesy, and ceremony. The midday meal in a castle hall was both ordinary and extraordinary ordinary for those who lived within that world, extraordinary for those who could only dream of it. In its abundance, we see the privileges of class. In its rituals, we see the culture of refinement. Lunch for nobles was not only about eating, but about being seen to eat, a performance of power that echoed long after the table was cleared. So far, we have lingered in fields, cloisters, and castle halls, but another setting for lunch in the Middle Ages deserves our attention. The bustling town where merchants, craftsmen, travelers, and townsfolk lived in closer quarters and ate in different ways. Unlike peasants who ate in the fields or nobles who feasted in great halls, the people of towns often relied on markets, inns, and street vendors for their midday meal. Here, lunch was not only about sustenance, but also about convenience and the energy to carry on with work or trade. In the narrow streets filled with noise, smells, and movement, lunch took on a livelier, more public character. The medieval town was alive with commerce. Merchants sold cloth, spices, or tools. Craftsmen labored in workshops, and travelers passed through on their way to distant places. For many of these people, especially those without the means or time to cook at home, the midday meal came from stalls and vendors who prepared food for sale. Street food was not new. It has existed as long as people have gathered in towns. In medieval Europe, it filled a vital role, feeding busy workers and offering variety to those who could afford a few coins. What did one find at these stalls? The offerings varied by region, but common foods included hot pies filled with meat or fish, small cakes, bread rolls, sausages, roasted nuts, and simple fried foods. In towns near rivers or coasts, fish might be sold fried or grilled, eaten quickly by those hurrying back to work. In larger markets, one could find vendors selling stews or soups by the bowl, which could be eaten with bread. Cheese and fruit were common, either fresh or dried, offering quick and portable sustenance. These foods were not always refined, but they were convenient, and in a world without restaurants as we know them today, they were essential for town life. Alehouses and taverns also provided meals at midday. These establishments catered to a wide range of people, merchants stopping between business, travelers seeking rest, or craftsmen taking a break from their work. A tavern lunch might consist of bread, cheese, pottage, and ale, served communally at wooden tables. In busier inns, meals could be richer, with roasted meats or stews provided for those willing to pay more. For townsfolk who lacked their own kitchens, especially in crowded urban housing, these public spaces provided an important alternative to home cooking. They were not only places to eat, but also places to gather, exchange news, and conduct business. Lunch in such settings was as much social as it was practical. For the poor in towns, markets and street food offered both opportunity and challenge. While some could buy a hot pie or a piece of fried fish, others relied on charity. Wealthier citizens or guilds sometimes provided food for the needy, distributing bread or pottage to the poor. Monasteries within towns also extended hospitality, feeding travelers and the destitute at their gates. For many, the hope of lunch came not from coins, but from the generosity of others. Hunger was common in towns, and while markets bustled with abundance, not everyone could share in it equally. Markets themselves were a sensory experience, and lunch was shaped by this atmosphere. Imagine the narrow streets crowded with stalls, the smell of roasting meat, the call of vendors shouting their wares, the clatter of carts, and the murmur of people haggling. A worker might pause to buy a hot pie, eat it with his hands, and wash it down with a cup of ale before returning to his trade. A merchant might step into an alehouse to eat bread and cheese while negotiating a deal. A child might nibble on a sweet cake bought from a vendor, savoring the rare treat. Lunch in the town was a meal of immediacy, taken in the midst of movement, shaped by the sounds and smells of urban life. The diversity of foods in towns was greater than in rural villages, thanks to trade. Spices, imported fruits, and exotic goods could be found in markets, especially in larger cities. A noble visiting a town might enjoy dishes flavored with cinnamon or pepper, while ordinary townsfolk might taste raisins or figs brought by traders. Though expensive, these items filtered into urban diets in ways they did not always reach the countryside. In this way, town lunches reflected not only necessity, but also the broader currents of commerce and connection that defined the medieval world. Guilds and fraternities also influenced town meals. Craftsmen organized into guilds often shared meals together, reinforcing bonds of fellowship. A guild lunch might be modest on ordinary days but lavish during festivals, with members gathering in halls to eat and drink as part of their communal identity. These meals, taken at midday, reflected both the practical need for sustenance and the social need for belonging. To eat together was to affirm one's place within the town's structure, just as much as to work together in craft and trade. The town also offered contrasts between rich and poor, much as in the countryside. Wealthier merchants might dine in comfort, eating meat pies, roasted poultry, or fish prepared with sauces, while poorer workers bought simpler fare from the street. Yet even the wealthiest merchant's lunch was shaped by the bustling life of the market, with food purchased, prepared, and consumed in spaces that echoed with the voices of many. The public nature of town life meant that meals were rarely private affairs. Lunch was always visible, part of the tapestry of commerce, community, and survival. Travelers passing through towns experienced lunch in their own way. Inns provided meals for those on the road, sometimes simple, sometimes more elaborate, depending on the establishment. A traveler might sit at a long table with strangers, sharing bread, stew, and ale, while exchanging stories of distant places. These meals were not only nourishment, but also part of the experience of the journey, a reminder that food connects people wherever they go. In this way, lunch in towns became a meeting place, a pause between departure and arrival, filled with both sustenance and human connection. Picture now the medieval town at midday. The streets are crowded, stalls piled high with bread, pies, cheese, and fruit. The smell of frying fish and roasting meat drifts through the air. A craftsman pauses at a stall, buying a hot pie that he eats as he walks back to his workshop. A group of merchants step into a tavern, sitting together over bread, cheese, and cups of ale, their voices rising as they discuss business. Children tug at their mother's sleeves, eager for a sweet cake or roasted nut. The poor linger near the gates of a monastery, waiting for alms of bread or pottage. The town hums with life, and lunch is woven into its very sound and movement. Street food and market lunches remind us that the medieval meal was not only shaped by class and religion, but also by place. In towns, food was more public, more varied, and more immediate, reflecting the energy of urban life. Whether bought from a vendor, shared in a tavern, or given as charity, lunch in the town carried the spirit of commerce, community, and connection. It was a meal of necessity, yes, but also of opportunity, shaped by the bustle of streets and the flow of trade. In this way, the town's midday meal adds yet another layer to the complex picture of lunch in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, food was inseparable from the rhythm of the seasons. Unlike today, when modern farming, refrigeration, and global trade allow us to eat strawberries in winter or oranges in summer, medieval people lived entirely at the mercy of nature's cycles. What appeared on the lunch table depended not only on wealth and class, but also on the time of year, the success of harvests, and the changing weather. To understand the medieval lunch fully, we must walk through the seasons and see how each one shaped the meals of peasants, nobles, and monks alike. Spring was a time of renewal, but also of scarcity. By March or April, the stored supplies from the previous harvest were often running low. Grain bins might be nearly empty, cheese wheels consumed, and salted meats dwindling. This period was sometimes called the hungry gap, when the old year's provisions were nearly gone, and the new year's crops had not yet matured. Lunch in spring could be meager thin pottages made with the last dried beans, bread stretched with poorer quality flour, and perhaps a few early greens like spinach, nettles, or sorrel. These fresh plants were eagerly welcomed, both for their flavor and for their ability to restore health after a winter diet heavy in grains and preserved foods. For peasants, spring lunches were simple but hopeful, a reminder that abundance was on its way, though not yet fully arrived. In monasteries, spring often coincided with Lent, making lunches even more restrained, with vegetables and legumes forming the heart of meals. For nobles, spring brought fresh lamb or early garden produce, but even their tables reflected the leaner season, with less variety than at harvest's peak. Summer brought relief and variety. Gardens filled with peas, beans, cabbages, onions, and herbs, while orchards offered cherries, plums, and early apples. Lunches for peasants could now include fresher pottages, more flavorful vegetables, and small fruits gathered from hedgerows. Bread was still ever present, but it was now joined by the freshness of the season. For nobles, summer meant not only fresh produce, but also opportunities for lavish outdoor feasts and hunts, with roasted game or spiced dishes served in shaded courtyards or pavilions. Monks harvested from their gardens, ensuring that lunches were filled with green vegetables, herbs, and legumes. Summer lunches were abundant, lightened by the season's generosity, yet always mindful of the labor that filled these months, for summer was the busiest time in the fields. Autumn was the season of harvest, and it brought the greatest abundance to the medieval table. Grain was gathered, fruits ripened, vegetables were pulled from the earth, and animals were sometimes slaughtered to provide meat for salting and storage. For peasants, this was the time when lunch could be rich, fresh bread from newly milled grain, vegetables in variety, and meat or fish eaten more freely after the harvest was secured. Celebrations and feasts often accompanied the harvest, and lunch might become a communal event, shared by families and villages together. For nobles, autumn was a time of plenty and display. Their tables groaned with dishes of game from the hunt, roasted meats, pies filled with fruits and spices, and wines from newly pressed grapes. In monasteries, Autumn meals reflected the same abundance, with fresh apples, pears, and nuts filling the refectory, alongside the steady bread and pottage. Lunch in autumn was a meal of gratitude, marking the success of the year's labors and preparing for the scarcity of winter to come. Winter, however, brought restraint. Fresh foods were gone, and lunch relied on stores carefully preserved from earlier months. Bread remained central, baked from grain that had been harvested and stored. Pottages were made from dried beans, peas, or lentils, flavored with cabbages that could be kept through the cold. Onions, garlic, and leeks added taste, while salted pork, bacon, or dried fish provided occasional protein. Cheese and butter, if supplies lasted, added richness, but by late winter, these too might run thin. For nobles, winter lunches still featured meat, game, and preserved delicacies. But even their kitchens faced the challenge of variety, relying on dried fruits, salted fish, and stored grains to carry them through. For monks, winter meals were steady but plain, shaped by the same preserved foods. Lunch in winter was functional, a reminder of survival and the careful planning needed to endure until spring returned. The cycle of seasons not only shaped what was eaten, but also influenced the meaning of lunch itself. In spring, lunch was modest and tinged with hope. In summer, it was fresh and abundant, a companion to labor. In autumn, it was celebratory, reflecting the joy of harvest. In winter, it was careful and restrained, a test of endurance. Each season brought its own rhythm, its own flavor, and its own lessons. To live in the Middle Ages was to live in deep awareness of these cycles, for one's very survival depended on them. Seasonal changes also highlighted the differences between classes. While peasants felt the hungry gap most sharply, nobles could cushion themselves with preserved stores and imported goods. While peasants celebrated the harvest with simple abundance, nobles turned it into lavish feasts. Yet even nobles were bound to the seasons, for no amount of wealth could conjure fresh cherries in winter or green cabbages in early spring. Their wealth allowed them variety, but not freedom from nature's rhythm. This shared dependence on the land united all classes, reminding rich and poor alike that food was ultimately a gift of the earth and the seasons. Religion, too, intersected with the seasons. Lent in spring, Advent in winter, feast days in autumn all shaped what was eaten at lunch. The church calendar reinforced the natural cycles, weaving fasting and feasting into the fabric of daily life. Thus, lunch was shaped not only by the turning of the year, but also by the rhythms of prayer, devotion, and faith. The body and the spirit moved together through the seasons, each shaping the other. Picture now the seasons of lunch across the medieval world. In spring, a peasant sits in the fields with bread and a handful of fresh greens, grateful for the new life after the lean months. In summer, monks eat beans and peas from their gardens, the air heavy with the scent of herbs. In autumn, a noble presides over a feast, platters of roasted game and fresh apples piled high, the hall alive with music. In winter, families huddle around a hearth, dipping bread into a thin pottage of dried peas, grateful for the warmth of the fire as much as the food in their bowls. Each season carries its own scene, its own meaning, its own flavor. The seasonal changes of the lunch table remind us that in the Middle Ages, people lived far more closely tied to the cycles of the earth than we do today. Their meals reflected not only wealth and class, but also the rhythm of nature, the turning of time, and the fragile balance of survival. To eat lunch was to live within this rhythm, to acknowledge the gifts of spring, the labors of summer, the bounty of autumn, and the endurance of winter. Lunch in the Middle Ages was never fixed, never uniform. It was a meal that changed with the seasons, carrying with it both the beauty and the hardship of a world deeply tied to nature as flow. In the Middle Ages, no discussion of lunch can be complete without considering the influence of religion. Faith permeated every aspect of daily life, from birth to death, from labor to leisure, and food was no exception. The medieval lunch table was not simply shaped by hunger, wealth, or the seasons. It was also shaped by the rules of the church. These rules, especially those surrounding fasting and abstinence, had a profound effect on what was eaten, when it was eaten, and even how it was thought about. Lunch in the medieval world was as much a spiritual matter as it was a physical one. The church prescribed many days of fasting and abstinence throughout the year, and these days touched directly upon the midday meal. On Fridays, for example, meat from four-legged animals was forbidden, a practice that continues in some Christian traditions, even today. During Lent, the 40 days before Easter, restrictions were even stricter. Not only was meat forbidden, but often dairy, eggs, and even certain fats were excluded as well. Advent, the period leading up to Christmas, also carried fasting requirements, though less strict than Lent. On these days, lunch had to be reshaped, rebuilt from foods that were permitted, and this meant that fish, legumes, bread, and vegetables became even more central than usual. For peasants, these restrictions could be both a challenge and a reminder of the church's power. A family who rarely ate meat anyway might not feel the loss of it at lunch, but the ban on dairy and eggs during Lent was more keenly felt. To go without butter or cheese at the midday meal, relying instead on bread and beans alone, could make the season seem long and difficult. Yet peasants were bound to these rules, just as nobles and clergy were, and to break them was not only a sin, but a potential social offense. The bells that marked the hours of prayer also marked the rhythm of fasting, binding everyone to the same calendar of restraint. For monks and clergy, fasting was even more central to the discipline of life. In monasteries, lunch on fast days was pared down to its simplest form: bread, legumes, and perhaps fish. Monastic rules often prohibited not only meat, but also rich or indulgent foods, meaning that lunch became an exercise in humility. Yet even within these restrictions, meals were prepared with care, and variety was found through the use of herbs, vegetables, or fish from monastery ponds. The simplicity of these lunches was not seen as deprivation, but as spiritual training, a reminder to deny the flesh in order to nourish the soul. For nobles, fasting created opportunities for display as much as for restraint. On fast days, their tables turned to fish, but not in simple forms. Instead, cooks prepared elaborate dishes of salmon, trout, or eel, flavored with spices and sauces. Imported fish such as sturgeon or even whale sometimes appeared at the wealthiest tables, demonstrating both piety and wealth. Noble cookbooks include recipes for fish pies, almond milk sauces, and spice stews designed for fasting days. In this way, nobles could obey the letter of the church's rules while still enjoying abundance. Lunch during Lent or on Fridays might lack meat, but it did not lack spectacle. To dine richly on fast days was, in a sense, another way of showing status. The practice of fasting was not limited to avoiding certain foods. It also sometimes meant reducing the number of meals. In stricter observances, lunch might be delayed or omitted, with only one main meal taken later in the day. This discipline was felt most strongly in monasteries and among the devout, though for ordinary people, the emphasis was usually on what was eaten rather than when. Still, the rhythm of meals could shift, making lunch a smaller, quieter, or entirely absent part of the day, depending on the season of fasting. To sit at a table and eat less, or to eat differently, was itself a reminder of spiritual duty. The symbolism of fasting days extended beyond the table. To refrain from meat was to refrain from indulgence, to humble oneself before God. To replace butter with oil, or milk with almond milk, was not only a practical substitution, but a spiritual exercise. Lunch on a fast day was a visible act of obedience, binding the body to the rhythm of faith. Even the act of eating fish, so common in fast day meals, carried spiritual meaning. Fish had long been a symbol of Christianity, and its presence on the table was a reminder of Christ himself. Thus, even the simplest lunch of bread, fish and vegetables became infused with sacred significance. For communities, fasting also carried a social weight. Everyone was bound by the same rules, rich and poor alike, creating a sense of shared discipline. Markets adjusted their offerings, with fishmongers selling more on Fridays and during Lent, while butchers saw their trade slow. Taverns and inns, too, adapted, serving meals that conformed to the church's rules. A calendar of fasting shaped the economy as much as it shaped the table, weaving faith into the very fabric of daily commerce. To eat lunch in a medieval town during Lent was to see not only your own table altered, but the whole community Oz as well. Yet, as with many rules, there were also ways around them. Dispensations could be granted by church authorities, allowing individuals or communities to eat certain foods otherwise forbidden. In some regions, butter dispensations were sold, permitting its use during Lent for those who could afford it. Nobles and wealthy monasteries sometimes obtained these exemptions, while peasants simply endured the restrictions. These differences revealed the tension between ideal and reality, showing how the same rules could weigh differently depending on wealth and power. Picture, then, the medieval lunch on a fast day. In a peasant's cottage, bread and beans are placed on the table, butter absent, cheese withheld, the meal plainer than usual, but shared in obedience. In a monastery, monks eat quietly, bowls of lentil pottage before them, scripture being read aloud as the meal proceeds. In a noble hall, servants bring forth platters of spiced fish, almond milk sauces, and candied fruits, turning abstinence into spectacle. All three meals are different, yet all are bound by the same rule, the same rhythm of faith that shaped the medieval world. The religious rules and fasting days of the Middle Ages remind us that lunch was never only about hunger or taste. It was also about obedience, humility, and community. To eat was to live, but to eat within the rules was to live faithfully. Whether endured with simplicity by peasants, embraced with discipline by monks, or transformed into display by nobles, the midday meal was always shaped by the hand of the church. Lunch in the Middle Ages was thus not only a reflection of class and season, but also of faith, carrying within it the weight of devotion and the rhythms of belief. While most of the medieval lunch was made from local foods, bread from nearby fields, vegetables from cottage gardens, fish from rivers, and cheese from the family herd, there was also another force that shaped meals, especially at the higher levels of society: trade. Across Europe, goods traveled from distant lands, carried by merchants on ships, caravans, and pack animals. These imported foods and spices brought new flavors, colors, and meanings to the lunch table, transforming simple meals into experiences of refinement and display. To speak of lunch in the Middle Ages without mentioning trade and spices would be to miss the connections between Europe and the wider world, connections that reached even into the bowls and trenchers of the midday meal. Spices were the most famous of these imports. Pepper from India, cinnamon and cloves from Asia, nutmeg from the Spice Islands, and ginger from the East all found their way into European kitchens. They were astonishingly expensive, carried along long trade routes that stretched across deserts, mountains, and seas. Yet despite their cost, spices were highly desired. They flavored meats and fish, enlivened vegetables, and turned ordinary pottages into extraordinary dishes. At noble lunches, the presence of spices signaled wealth and sophistication. A lord might serve a fish pottage flavored with saffron, or a sauce of almonds and cinnamon poured over roasted meat. These flavors were unfamiliar to peasants, whose meals were seasoned only with local herbs. But in castles and manors, they became central to the performance of refinement. Sugar, too, entered European diets through trade, though in the early Middle Ages it was rare and precious. Unlike honey, which was produced locally, sugar had to be imported from the Mediterranean and the Middle East. At noble tables, sugar was used to sweeten wines, sauces, and fruits, creating dishes that combined sweetness with spice. Candied fruits, preserved with sugar, became delicacies at the end of meals, often appearing at lunch in noble households. To serve sugar was to demonstrate not only wealth, but also access to the networks of trade that connected Europe to far-off lands. It was a taste of the exotic, a glimpse of the wider world, brought into the rhythms of the midday meal. Imported fruits also shaped noble lunches. Dates and figs from the Mediterranean, raisins from Spain and beyond, and almonds from North Africa or Southern Europe all found their way into dishes. Raisins, in particular, became a common ingredient in sauces and pottages, providing sweetness and depth of flavor. Almonds were especially prized, not only as nuts, but as the basis for almond milk, a substitute for dairy during fasting days. Almond milk appeared in countless recipes, from soups to sauces, making it one of the most versatile and important imports of the medieval kitchen. At lunch, a noble might be served fish in almond milk, or a custard flavored with sugar and almonds, each bite carrying the imprint of distant lands. For peasants, these imported foods were far beyond reach. Their lunches remained rooted in the local and the familiar, flavored with parsley, sage, or onions rather than cinnamon or pepper. Yet even peasants were touched indirectly by trade. Salt, essential for preserving meat and fish, was often traded across long distances, and its presence shaped what could be eaten at lunch. Dried herring, preserved and shipped in vast quantities from the North Sea and Baltic, reached villages and towns across Europe, providing a vital source of protein, especially during fasting days. Though peasants could not taste cinnamon or sugar, they did eat fish caught hundreds of miles away, carried by the networks of trade that tied together distant communities. In towns, trade brought more variety. Markets offered dried fruits, imported nuts, or spices in small amounts, sold by merchants who had traveled or who bought from larger trading centers. For wealthier townsfolk and merchants, these goods offered a chance to emulate noble refinement, adding raisins to a dish or using a pinch of pepper in pottage. Lunch in a prosperous town might thus carry hints of the wider world, though always in moderation. The majority of people could not afford such luxuries, but the very presence of these goods in markets shows how trade reached into daily life, even if unevenly. Monasteries also benefited from trade, particularly wealthier ones. Almonds, raisins, and spices sometimes appeared in monastic kitchens, used to enrich meals on feast days or to comply with fasting rules. Almond milk, in particular, became important in monasteries, allowing cooks to prepare dishes without dairy during periods of abstinence. Thus, even within cloisters dedicated to simplicity, trade shaped the contents of lunch, tying the rhythm of monastic meals to the flow of distant goods. The symbolism of spices and imported foods was as important as their taste. To serve a dish flavored with cinnamon or saffron was to show that one belonged to the world of wealth, connection, and culture. These foods were not only eaten, they were displayed, spoken of, and written into cookbooks that circulated among noble households. A lunch of spiced fish or almond custard was not merely nourishment, it was a statement of identity. To eat exotically was to live exotically, even within the walls of a castle or manor. The act of eating lunch thus became a way of participating in global trade, of tasting the distant and the rare. Trade also created differences between regions. In southern Europe, closer to the Mediterranean, access to almonds, figs, raisins, and olive oil was more common. In northern Europe, preserved fish, salted meats, and imported spices played a larger role. These regional differences meant that lunch looked different across Europe, shaped not only by class and season, but by geography and trade. A noble in Italy might eat figs and almonds at lunch, while a noble in England might eat salted herring and dishes flavored with pepper. Both meals reflected wealth, but each was tied to the specific flows of trade that touched that land. Imagine the noble lunch table with trade at its heart. Platters of fish are served in almond milk, flavored with saffron, their golden color gleaming in the light of the hall. Bowls of rice, imported from the Mediterranean, appear beside pies filled with raisins and figs. Trenchers are laid with roasted meats, sprinkled with pepper, their richness deepened by cinnamon or cloves. A final course of candied fruits, glistening with sugar, ends the meal, leaving guests marveling not only at the taste, but at the wealth and connections of their host. Every bite tells a story of distance, of merchants and caravans, of ships and markets. Lunch becomes more than a meal. It becomes a statement of place in a world that stretched far beyond the castle walls. Even for those who never tasted these foods, the knowledge of their existence mattered. The awareness that nobles ate dishes flavored with spices or fruits from distant lands reinforced the sense of social difference. The peasant's bread and cheese stood in sharp contrast to the lord's spiced pottage. The very gap in flavor was a reminder of the gap in wealth and status. Lunch thus became another way in which inequality was made visible, not only in what was eaten, but in how it tasted. In the end, trade and imported foods remind us that the medieval lunch was not only local, but global. Though most meals were built from the fields, gardens, and rivers nearby, the touch of cinnamon, the sweetness of a raisin, or the richness of almond milk carried with it the breath of distant lands. For nobles, these foods were a way of showing wealth and connection. For monasteries, they were tools of adaptation. For townsfolk, they were rare glimpses of the exotic. Lunch in the Middle Ages, shaped by trade, was thus not only a meal, but a map of the world, drawn in flavors and carried on the tongue. As we near the end of our journey through the medieval lunch table, it is worth pausing to reflect on what all these foods, customs, and rhythms truly meant. Lunch in the Middle Ages was not only about nourishment, nor was it simply about survival or indulgence. It was also about identity, about who you were, where you belonged, and what your place in society demanded of you. More than any particular dish of bread, pottage, meat, or fish, it was the company, the class distinctions, and the culture surrounding the meal that gave it meaning. Lunch was not simply eaten. It was lived, and in its quiet way, it revealed the deep structure of the medieval world. For the peasant, lunch was a moment of rest in a life of toil. It was taken in the fields, on the edge of a plowed furrow, or in a cottage smoky with the smell of the hearth. It was quick, simple, and often repetitive. Bread, cheese, onions, pottage, ale, yet it carried profound meaning. To share a crust with one's family or neighbors was to affirm bonds of community and survival. The act of eating together sustained not only the body, but also the spirit, reminding peasants that they were part of a wider whole, enduring hardship together. Their lunches were not glamorous, but they were deeply social, binding the fabric of village life through small acts of sharing and fellowship. For monks, lunch was a practice of devotion and discipline. Taken in silence, structured by prayer, and governed by rules of restraint, the midday meal became a spiritual exercise as much as a physical one. To eat in the refectory, listening to scripture read aloud, was to place one's hunger within the context of faith. The very simplicity of bread, pottage, fish, and cheese was a reminder of humility and moderation, values at the heart of monastic life. Yet here, too, lunch was social. Monks sat side by side, equal in their silence, their meal a communal act that bound them into a brotherhood. The social meaning of lunch in monasteries was not about display, but about unity, about the shared commitment to a life of prayer and work. For nobles, lunch was perhaps the most visibly social of all. To sit in the great hall at midday, surrounded by guests, retainers, and servants, was to participate in a grand display of hierarchy and culture. Lunch in a noble household was never only about eating. It was about showing generosity to guests, demonstrating wealth through spices and imported foods, and affirming power through abundance. The rituals of hand-washing, the sequence of courses, the music, and the manners all transformed lunch into ceremony. To be invited to dine was to be honored. To be excluded was to be reminded of one's place. For nobles, lunch was theater as much as sustenance, a stage on which the culture of refinement and hierarchy was performed for all to see. Across all these groups, lunch reflected class distinctions, yet it also revealed points of connection. Bread appeared on every table, from the coarse barley loaves of peasants to the fine wheat manchets of nobles. Pottage, in its humble or elaborate forms, was eaten by all. Cheese, vegetables, and fish appeared across the spectrum, though in different ways and with different meanings. These common threads remind us that beneath the surface of inequality, there was a shared human rhythm, a shared need to pause at midday, to eat, to drink, and to restore the body. Lunch was both divided by class and united by humanity, both unequal and shared. The culture of lunch also extended beyond the food itself. It was about time, the pause at sext, the rhythm of work and prayer, the cycle of seasons and fasts. It was about place fields, cloisters, halls, markets, each shaping the way the meal was experienced. And it was about community families gathered in cottages, monks seated in silence, nobles surrounded by guests. Lunch was never solitary. It was always bound up in social ties, whether humble or grand, and in this way it reflected the very nature of medieval life, communal, structured, and deeply embedded in networks of obligation and belonging. Even the act of eating itself carried cultural meaning. To eat with hands, to share from a common dish, to follow rules of courtesy or silence. All these practices shaped identity. They told people not only how to eat, but who they were. A peasant tearing bread with calloused fingers, a monk lifting a spoon in silence, a noble delicately carving meat with a knife. All these gestures spoke of social place as clearly as the food itself. Lunch was a mirror of society, reflecting its divisions, its rules, and its values in every act of eating. The social meaning of lunch also extended to the imagination. In art, literature, and moral teaching, meals were depicted not only as scenes of eating, but as lessons. The Last Supper, the meals of saints, the banquets of kings all carried symbolic weight, teaching lessons about humility, pride, generosity, or gluttony. To eat lunch in the Middle Ages was to participate in a world where food was always more than food. It was moral, spiritual, and cultural, woven into the way people understood themselves and their world. Imagine, then, the different lunches once more. A peasant family in a field, breaking bread and passing ale, their laughter and conversation carrying across the furrows. Monks in a refectory, heads bowed, hands moving quietly, the sound of scripture rising above them. Nobles in a great hall, trenchers laid with meat and fish, goblets of wine raised, musicians filling the air with song. 3 very different meals, yet all taken at the same time of day, all answering the same human need for nourishment, all shaped by the same rhythm of life. In each, lunch was more than a meal. It was a reflection of class, of culture, and of community. In the end, lunch in the Middle Ages was a deeply social act. It told people who they were, reminded them of where they belonged, and gave meaning to the ordinary rhythm of the day. Whether quick and filling, silent and disciplined, or elaborate and ceremonial, it was never just food on a table. It was the heart of daily life, a mirror of society, and a reminder that even in a world divided by class and wealth, the simple act of eating at midday was something that bound all people together. And so we have walked together through the world of the medieval lunch, through the fields where peasants paused from their toil, through the cloisters where monks ate in silence, and into the great halls where nobles turned dining into ceremony. We have seen how bread and pottage sustained the poor, how cheese and fish carried monks through fasting days, and how spices and imported fruits became symbols of power on noble tables. We have watched the meal change with the seasons, grow humble on fast days, and expand into spectacle when wealth permitted. In all of this, lunch in the Middle Ages was never just about filling the stomach. It was about survival, faith, identity, and community. It was a meal that told people who they were, where they belonged, and how they lived within the great rhythm of the world. As you drift now into rest, let the images of those long-ago tables linger gently in your mind. The crust of bread torn in the field, the silent spoon lifted in the monastery, the golden goblet raised in the hall. They are echoes of a past world, carried across centuries to remind us that food is more than nourishment. It is memory, meaning, and life itself. Before you go, I'd love to invite you once more to subscribe to this channel, *History for Sleep*. If you enjoy these long, calming journeys into the past, subscribing helps us bring you more stories to ease your mind and carry you into sleep. And if you have ideas for future topics, or if you'd like to share when you usually listen at night to fall asleep, in the afternoon to relax, or in the quiet hours of the early morning, please leave a comment. Your thoughts and requests shape the stories we tell here, making each one more meaningful. Thank you for joining me on this gentle walk through history. May your rest be peaceful, your dreams calm, and your sleep deep. Until next time, when we explore another corner of the past together, good night.